4 p.m. in the Russian capital. You're watching RT International with me, Marina Joshi. Welcome to the program. Now, Washington is considering military strikes against Syrian army positions, according to media reports citing U.S. government sources. That's after America severed talks with Russia over the Syrian peace process. At the same time, the White House says it realizes that attacks on President Assad's forces would bring Russia and the U.S. closer to conflict.
There's a risk associated with taking strikes at regime targets. That risk includes attacking a regime that does continue to maintain a robust air defense system. It also edges U.S. and Russian military forces closer to confrontation. It doesn't serve anybody's interest.
America's decision to end ceasefire negotiations with Russia has damaged the peace process in Syria. Washington blames Moscow for being ineffective in the fight against ISIL. In reaction, Russia said the U.S. appears ready to, quote, strike a deal with the devil to achieve its aims in Syria. With diplomacy faltering, we asked the U.S. State Department what comes next.
I went to ask the State Department what led to the failure of diplomacy. Didn't it fail after some rebel groups, specifically al-Sham in Aleppo, used the ceasefire to strengthen their positions? Didn't it fail after ISIL nearly took over Deir ez-Zor following the U.S. bombing of the Syrian military, admittedly by mistake? Did those things play no role in the failure of that deal?
There was a series of events, certainly the attack by mistake on Syrian forces, but then followed by the attack on the humanitarian convoy, and then subsequently by an increase in attacks on civilian targets in Aleppo. Look, we can talk all about the fact that some rebel groups or some opposition groups may have used the pause to resupply. That's a reality.
When questioned on the events that preceded the collapse of the deal, the State Department does concede, kind of half-heartedly, that the rebels had a role to play. But Washington's predominant narrative is that Russia and Assad suddenly rejected diplomacy and chose a military solution. Interesting that Secretary Kerry himself at one time argued for a military action against the Syrian government, as he told members of the Syrian opposition last week in a conversation that was leaked. He said he lost that argument and proceeded with President Obama's policy. On the question about whether everyone on the U.S. side was on the same page when negotiating the deal with Russia, here's what the State Department said today.
You said that the interagency process is very effective and creates a single policy. Isn't the idea once the president makes up his mind and decides on the policy that the dissenters shut up and don't complain publicly about?
Precisely. I mean, that's
did that happen in this case?
Again, on a policy and an issue as like Syria, I mean, you know, any given day, there's different elements and different dynamics to be considered, and I think that you know that always goes into. Yes.
Did it create a single policy with no dissent?
Yes.
Okay, it did, because there were a lot of people complaining about it.
I understand that there's
not secretly, not whispering in the background.
I understand that there's a perception of that. But what I would say is that
doesn't that compromise the effectiveness of this?
Again, you know, we carried out the policy that the president had dictated.
Media reports now say the Obama administration is again considering military action. And we may, once again, see a divergence of views within the administration on how to proceed in Syria.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the Syrian conflict is claiming more innocent lives. The University of Aleppo has been hit by a rocket attack carried out by rebel forces. RT's Murad Gizdiyev is in the embattled city right now and visited the injured.
It was a morning like any other. Classes had just finished and bored and tired students were making their way to dormitories. That's when the first of the shells hit Aleppo University.
The people of Aleppo are no strangers to shelling. They know to run for cover. Unfortunately, not everyone had the time.
One student, Majid, was unlucky enough to be caught in the first blast. This is where he was standing, and this is where the blood trail begins. We followed it all the way to the end. Obviously panicked, he tried to run away, tried to find cover. He ran behind this car and bled. They've covered most of it with sand, but Majid dropped his textbook here. He was a second-year student, and today was the last day of studies that he would ever have. He died a few hours after the attack.
We went to one of the hospitals to which victims of this attack had been taken. We wanted to speak to the survivors. This is 15-year-old Rama. She'd lost an eye.
I was standing when the explosion happened. I felt stunned and fell to my knees. I could feel something in my back. I collapsed, and some guys came and took me to the hospital.
In all, 5 students were killed today. 5 more in critical condition in hospital, and 17 have been released with minor injuries. Nevertheless, from the fact that almost all of the 11 blasts happened inside the campus of the university, tells us that this was a pre-planned attack and not the first time that rebels have targeted Aleppo University.
Meanwhile, the UK Prime Minister Theresa May says political transition in Syria without Assad is needed, adding to the motto, Assad must go. That has been a mainstay of the West rhetoric.
The levels of violence we're seeing, the way in which the Syrian regime is indiscriminately bombing its own civilians. We need a political transition to a Syria without Assad.
Last month, Theresa May said it was better to help refugees in their own countries, but research analyst Kamal Alam says this idea contradicts the UK's support for regime change in Syria.
From all the countries in Europe, Britain has been one of the biggest supporters of the Syrian opposition, so they definitely believe that the Syrian opposition is the only solution to the answer, but they're ignoring the facts on the ground, which are that the more they support the opposition and the more the war goes on, the more refugees will spill out of Syria. Europe cannot deal with another massive influx of refugees. Germany tried to with the best of intentions, but they got it wrong. Similarly, Eastern Europe and Central Europe are struggling, so is France. England actually have not taken many refugees, less than 20,000. So Britain, whilst makes a lot of noise about the humanitarian cause in Syria, have not taken many refugees.